All right, everybody. Well, it's a minute after the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. We are recording this, so folks who join late or aren't able to participate can um, at least have the opportunity to listen to the discussion. But I'm really excited to welcome you all to the conversation about the Intergovernmental Systems Panel's paper on homelessness. Hopefully you had a chance to listen to the podcast with Rich and Catherine earlier this week. Maybe you've had a chance to look at the paper. I think this is just a really terrific product and it advances so much of our work. But you don't need me to tell you all the details. You can hear from the experts as we go through today. So Nancy, I'm going to turn it over to you to get the conversation started.
Terrific. Thank you, Terry. And thanks to everybody in the room. We're looking forward to talking about this report, so long in the making. And I think we're all very happy with the way it turned out. So heartfelt kudos to all of the working group and the staff that helped with it. So I think everybody knows me. I'm Nancy Augustine, Director of the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships at the Academy. I am only here to facilitate Rich and Steve talking about the report. Rich and Steve, perhaps you could just briefly introduce yourselves as you talk, but let's start off with the basics. How did this report come about?
Rich, do you want to start?
Sure. Nancy, you mentioned this report's a long time in coming. I started working on this issue in the late 80s in LA County, working for an amazing supervisor, Ed Edelman. And it is an issue societally that really has continued to emerge. And we are fortunate, Steve and I, to co-chair a wonderful group of NAPA fellows and NAPA staff who really contributed. This is a report that everyone contributed to in great depth. And so we were asked by the co-chairs of the Intergovernmental Systems Panel at NAPA, Mark Pisano and Shelley Metzenbaum, to see if there were people interested. And so more than 14 NAPA fellows volunteered with experience at county, state, city, and federal government levels to bring things together. And Steve and I co-chaired it. We had a very constructive tension. Steve looked at things from a federal perspective with his OMB experience and the continuums of care. And he said, the federal government's really set this up for solving this. And I looked at it from my experience in county government and working in the state of California. And I said, local governments and states get things solved in homelessness in spite of the federal government. So we had a very good tension going forward. And I can't say enough about the great staff, Brad, Riley, and Lauren, and the great members of the committee that worked on this.
So, I may should start with the impetus. The immediate impetus for this was from Shelley and Mark and the Intergovernmental Systems Panel, who charged us with looking at homelessness in depth as an intergovernmental issue. And Rich was the perfect partner for me in helping to lead this effort, along with Barbara Dyer and Catherine Willoughby, other people I see here, and Brad and Nancy supported us throughout. So we've been working for about 20 months now as a team, working group, and learned a lot. And I should start by saying that, I have a history like Rich with this issue. He mentioned that I worked at OMB. I was the branch chief for housing and urban development for 12 years there. And so a lot of the work I did on homelessness was in the context of the federal budget, including bringing together the major programs in HUD to form what became the Continuum of Care program, and to commit to take to the director the question, should we commit the administration, this was the Bush administration, second Bush administration, to ending chronic homelessness? And they said, yeah, let's put that in the budget. So we did. So there's a history here that goes across several administrations led by different presidents of different parties, and we are building on that. And we're looking at what the current administration is doing. We'll talk about that. As Rich said, we have different perspectives. My federal perspective on the issue is very different than Rich's. And we also had within the working group a diversity of geography. We had a strong contingent
Absolutely. Let's do that. And Steve, let's start with you. So from looking at the experience of local people, how do you see the roles of the different levels of government? You've got the federal perspective. Let's start with that and then turn to Rich for the state and local.
Sure. Well, this is inherently an intergovernmental problem. And I mean that in two dimensions, not just the vertical, federal, state, and local, who have to work together effectively and have different complementary roles, ideally. But also horizontally, in each community, the actors have to pull things together across geography, different geographic jurisdictions, but also functionally, the functional silos, which grow out to some extent. We can talk more about this, which are an outgrowth of the way the federal government organizes its assistance to localities, creates a kind of siloed system where the agencies don't, as a natural act, collaborate to solve a boundary crossing problem like homelessness. So that has been one of the central challenges. And the federal government, I should say, has been helpful in several ways. First of all, they have consistently, with a break maybe during the Trump years, but more or less consistently promulgated a housing first strategy, which is evidence-based. That is, it's based on research, which we cited when we worked on this issue back in the 80s and the 90s, that says the first step in getting people off the street or out of emergency shelters and is to put them into a housing unit, which obviously requires housing assistance, and then link them with other services. So that housing first strategy has been the federally endorsed strategy, and it's given people a starting point at the local level, state level, to work on this issue. Second, they provided funding, not just for housing assistance, but also through the local continuum of care, usually a nonprofit organization, sometimes part of local government, continuum of care organization, which is itself a coalition typically of entities. And they are the ones who are charged specifically with taking the lead on homelessness. They don't have any authority over the other parts of the local services system and leadership, but they can be a coordinator and shaper of strategy and shape the continuum of the housing first strategy. They can shape it to local conditions and circumstances, which are quite varied, of course. And then the federal government has also mandated by statute the development by each continuum of care organization at the local level, a grant recipient, of a housing management information system to support planning and to support their operations, and encourage people to develop real-time, comprehensive, person-level data on the homeless population and their experiences as they move through the system and around the local geography. So in that way, the federal government has provided essential leadership. At the same time, as I said, the federal assistance is structured in a way that complicates local efforts to implement a coordinated strategy. And the siloed program structure that the federal government's pattern of assistance creates emphasizes upward accountability. It has inconsistent eligibility requirements that have to be somehow reconciled. It creates a burdensome application and reporting process that sometimes forces people to just throw up their hands and imagine how that looks also from the point of view of an individual homeless person. So it's left to the locals to pull this together and fill in the gaps. And Rich, you have a perspective on this from your work.
Yeah, on the local government side, Steve has done a great job of describing the intergovernmental system structure. In working with Mark Pisano and Shelley and the panel over the years, and with the former co-chair Paul Posner, I've really come to understand the intergovernmental system is how we problem solve in our society. Our most complex problems are solved in the intergovernmental system, with the exception of old age poverty, which has been addressed through Social Security. One of the features that really jumped out in looking at city, county, and regional government, and we have one of the real leaders in looking at regions, Bill Dodge, who served on our committee. What jumps out is, as Steve described, there's a structure. What jumps out when you look at it from the local perspective is people make a difference. You have this structure, you have this system, you have these institutions in place, but each of the three successful areas that we looked at, Houston, Central Massachusetts, and Santa Clara, it really was the people who made a difference, whether as elected officials, whether as appointed lead staff person, whether it was as director of a nonprofit, that they served as a catalyst within each of these systems of bringing people together, both vertically, as Steve described, and horizontally across sectors. And so the real lesson to us in this, to me, in looking at these jurisdictions, is how much difference expertise, professionalism, and commitment can really make to be catalyst for a community that engages in the most challenging of societal challenges, and really seeks to provide housing for people who are experiencing homelessness.
And we've looked, I think we should emphasize, we've looked in depth at and talked with people in 3 places that are very diverse in their experiences and circumstance. And one of them is Santa Clara, which is Silicon Valley in California. Another is Houston in Texas, where the state government is not involved at all, unlike California, where the state's heavily involved. And the third is a semi-rural area of region in north central Massachusetts, a hodgepodge of local jurisdictions and counties and so on. And so we've tried to synthesize from their efforts certain basic tasks that have to be performed in order to be successful. Nancy, do you want to?
Yeah, and Steve, why don't you talk about those tasks? So just to recap where we are. So you talked to practitioners in these 3 places. You did research, and of course, everybody brought enormous expertise to the table. You came up with 5 big tasks. Tell us about them.
Sure. Okay. And again, we talked to other people in other places, and also talked to people who are working with communities across the country, like the Community Solutions national nonprofit, which is doing excellent work in this area. And we identified these tasks, and I'll describe them as a sequence, but they're more. It's more complicated than that. The first one is, as Rich was alluding to, key leaders in an area, metropolitan area or a region, typically come together around the issue and help to forge an alliance that cuts across geography, local jurisdictions, and so on, and is committed to a goal. So the first step we saw in each of these places was key leaders. Often it's an elected official, could be a county supervisor, as in Santa Clara, or mayor, as in Houston, or a legislative representative for a local jurisdiction, as in Massachusetts, and others. They are catalysts and boundary crossers, as Don Kettle, who's part of our working group, would say. And they say, let's work together. And they have a shared definition which they can quantify of what their objectives are, and they try to forge agreements around those. And they bring in other people, and they create therefore a plan and a strategy to achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. So that's really the first organizing phase, if you like. And then building on that agreement and consensus, they're able to build out an actual interorganizational network to coordinate and synchronize their work and make the contribution of each partner fit with the work of other entities that are funded separately, organized differently. And they do this through forming informal understandings in several cases, but often more formal service level agreements that spell out how people are going to work together and coordinate. And they use that network then as a third step to deliver timely integrated services that are appropriate to the needs that are specific to each homeless individual. Each individual has a different experience and set of disabilities or other needs that need to be addressed. And that requires them using the network to align the federally and state funded programs that are separately administered. And they use those to identify gaps in the system and to fill those gaps. For example, if there's no agency that's clearly responsible for outreach to people on the street, they have to figure out who's going to do that work, which is critical. To getting started with each person to get them on the path to housing. And then they have to create a seamless delivery system that fits the local context. And these are quite varied contexts. And then finally, an area that Shelley and Beth Bauer have worked on, among others, and talked to experts about how do you use the HMIS that I mentioned as a mandate and the data that it generates, especially data on individual homeless people and their experiences as they move through the services system. How do you use that both to inform planning and to prioritize the use of resources, and then in other words, to target particular groups, let's say people who are coming out of incarceration who might be at risk of homelessness, or people who fall into homelessness through abusive relationships and many other paths into homelessness. And then how do you use that data to track the assistance to make sure that it gets to the people in a timely way and it is effective in helping them? And then finally, over time, this informal or formal network has to institutionalize itself. You can't rely forever on just a few key leaders. You have to figure out ways to organize the governance or government of this system and to sustain it financially over time, because there's a continued need here in each of these places to deal with people who become homeless, and also to create sustainable housing subsidies or other forms of assistance in housing in a critical mass to deal with this population. And so that, as I said, this can be described as a sequence, but I think it's better thought of as nested layers of continuous activity that interact in specific ways so that they're mutually reinforcing. For example, as you get experience with the delivery model, gaps are identified, and you can use that to bring new actors into the network. And as data-informed learning takes place over time, you get a better understanding that it makes you more effective and sharper in defining the problem and the goals that you're trying to achieve. And we saw formal organizations start sometimes earlier with natural response to a natural disaster or a health emergency. Over time, you have to figure out how to institutionalize those and sustain them financially. So those are the 5 tasks that we identified by looking at these places in depth and then at other places. And we saw them as contributing to their success.
What I'd like to add is really what this group has done and what NAPA has done through its commitment to this project, not only Nancy at the Center for Intergovernmental Partnership, but really the executive director, Terry Gerton, and Miles and Brad and Lauren and Coleman. This commitment of NAPA staff and resources and the fellows on the working group have really positioned homelessness as an issue, as a central issue in public administration. And when I first looked at this academically about 5 years ago, there was virtually no one in public administration leading journals, the 7 leading journals, the only author I could really find looking at it was a wonderful researcher out of University of Chicago and now at UCLA, Jennifer Mosley, on networks. And what NAPA has done, and particularly through the Intergovernmental Systems panel, has said homelessness is not on the peripheral of what public administration should focus on, but is central to what we care about and how we make difference in the lives of those most vulnerable in our society.
So now let's talk about what comes next. So you didn't come up with recommendations. Rather, you talked about different things that that different levels of government should consider. If you like, I can bring those up, or I can let you talk. But yeah, Steve, I guess it makes sense again to start with federal, and then we'll go to Rich for the state and local.
Let's start with local. We start with federal,
Okay.
and this is, you are experiencing exactly the tension that the creative tension, or
Fair.
as Rick Rubin, the famous producer of rock and roll and hip hop, said, the creative act, that you are experiencing that in our discussion. What I'd like to say before Steve goes into this is really one of our contributions, and the generosity of people that we interviewed who are working on this issue, both in the communities that we already talked about, but people throughout. The Community Solutions, Roseanne Haggerty, who works in over her and her staff in 100 different communities, people I've interviewed in different counties in California. People are really committed to helping us develop clarity about what are the key questions moving forward. And as any of us on this call know, the first step to really moving forward on an issue is problem identification. And really, as you look at the work of Agile government, what's the end user experience? What are people experiencing? And so these questions that Steve will start to go over are contribution and the next step of really, how do we continue to engage NAPA and continue to build out the partnerships we've developed and future partnerships to really help clarify and come to a deeper understanding of the issues, so we can recommend building on the effective actions that are occurring today. So with that, I'll turn it over to my federal partner.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to let you say more about what we suggested people work on at the local and state levels, and I'm
Okay.
happy to move up from the bottom. I think this issue does look very different from if you start at the bottom of the pyramid, if you like, of the federal system. Then if you start at the top, the federal government, when it talks about coordinated activity, talks about forming a cabinet level council and common policies and so on. At the federal, at the local level, you're looking up at a really a net a set of tubes, if you like the internet, that are not connected and don't easily connect. So it looks very different from each end of the system.
And it's really the challenge of going from a bureaucracy to the challenge of developing partnerships. And I think each of the three different areas that we looked at demonstrated what partnership looks like, and it looks different in each of the three areas, or three regions. Nancy, if you post the questions, I'm glad to start our discussion of what we've identified.
Absolutely. Yep. Let me get to that.
And as Nancy's calling that up, part of our discussion today, and Nancy asked about next steps, we're open to refining these questions because we're going to continue to pursue them. And we welcome feedback today or in the future on this as you look at this report and say, here's one of your questions, but you might consider the following. And so what we really look at in terms of local government, and I really don't like the term local government. I really prefer to use the term city, county, districts, or regional and state government, because local government implies, it really lumps together a lot of what's going on. And so the first question and the way we phrase it is in terms of leverage. How can we leverage existing resources? And then what would help to facilitate these types of discussions? And then how can localities build on the work of the COC and build on information systems to get at these questions? And then what steps can the federal government, can federal and state agencies take to really get at partnerships so that it's not a top-down, bottom-up, but it's a sense of really partners working together to really get at some of the most important societal challenges? And then how can you develop regional governance? Because people experiencing homelessness are not necessarily limited to one geographic or one political district, though a recent report from University of California, San Francisco on the demographics of homelessness identified the overwhelming number of people who are experiencing homelessness come from the county that they're experiencing in. There's not this mass migrations across political boundaries, but again, it's a regional challenge. And then in terms of state government, really thinking about how can the state partner and support local and regional efforts? What are coordinating and grant reporting requirements that can be used to not just for oversight, but to facilitate success? And then how can state really help identify and efforts that are being made, particularly around housing? But one of the real challenges and one of the pieces that Napa can significantly contribute to is when you find things that work, how can you share those across multiple jurisdictions and state governments in a good position to do that? And then really the data we found in some of the regions and the discussions nationally is how important it is to identify data. And Shelley and Beth were very important in this, as well as community solutions. How can the data really drive two things? Individual successes, so you're tracking and helping individuals, and then collective successes because you're seeing what the data is showing. And then finally, how to really consider training and other efforts to support those working in the housing field and those working with people experiencing homelessness, and really investing in the human capital so that we can make a difference in a lot of different lives. So briefly, there's some of the questions and some of the directions that we're going to engage in moving forward. You'll notice the report is titled The First Report. So we look at this as an invitation to really continue this important focus and work out of Napa. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
I'd like to say more about that, but let's start with state government. What struck me, I think the rest of us, is how different the role of the state is in each of the three places we looked at. I mentioned in Houston, the state is essentially not engaged.
But they do provide 10% of the funding to that city, and that was an important point that they brought out.
Right, sometimes through federals.
Yeah.
Right. And on the other hand, you have a place like Minnesota, where the governor has created a counterpart to the Federal Interagency Council on Homelessness. They're more engaged. And I mentioned that the state, actually in Massachusetts, and Brad and Barbara know about this more than I do, part of the local governing group that oversees the effort to end homelessness there in central Massachusetts is a state housing finance agency, and they sit at the table. So they're right there. And in California, of course, there's kind of almost an adversarial relationship with the governor pressing local governments by using the funding levers that the state provides. They provide a lot of resources, but they also say, in order to do this, to get these resources, you have to set ambitious goals and make progress in ending homelessness. So very different approaches in each case that we looked at by different roles played by the state. So that's a feature of our system. Maybe it's a strength of our system that states can take different tacks, but it's something that has to be thought about. And another critical point about the state's role is that they deliver the Medicaid funding, which is critical to potentially critical to delivering housing assistance or support in finding housing at the local level. But again, the states vary so much. Some have taken advantage of the waiver authority that's provided in Medicaid to support social determinants of health, including housing. California is one of those, a leader really, and others have done nothing. So it's quite varied. So that I guess takes us to the federal level. Nancy, you want to look at these with me? So what strikes me as, again, Rich said, we don't make recommendations so much as we pose questions for further exploration, which we're planning to engage in with our federal partners. There's been a long history with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness as a coordinating group, cabinet level council. Dave Garrison knows about this from his work at HHS. And it's varied quite a bit in its effectiveness. Currently, it is leading a strategy and providing a lot of assistance. In the Obama administration, a subset of this council, especially HUD and VA, the Veterans Affairs, focused on veterans homelessness, and they, over that 8-year period or so, they cut veterans homelessness by 50%. Which shows that this housing first strategy applied with enough resources and focus can be effective. So one of our questions for further discussion with the federal folks is, can we take this to scale? Can we, building on the current strategy, as well as the limited Interagency Council's Technical Assistance Initiative, they call it All Inside, that helps selected major metropolitan areas address homelessness and supports their local strategies with funding and so on. Can we take this to scale? Can we get it organized in a way that people use the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, for example, to come in from state and local government as part of a team, and vice versa? The feds can use the IPA channel to go work in a locality. And again, this builds on and would be a more robust version of what the ICH is doing now. Focusing in particular on disability determinations, which are critical for eligibility for SSI or SSDI income assistance. And this is a very poor population with a high rate of disabilities of various kinds, including substance abuse. They need support. Could we use the waiver authorities that are available in Medicaid? Could we use other means to improve this disability determination at the state level? It's really a state administered function of Social Security. Can we take advantage of the flexibilities in setting priorities for HUD's housing programs to help the disabled to prioritize this population, help them pay the rents, and reinforce the housing first approach? So that's a second idea that we want to explore with SSA and with other people. Can we support local housing authorities who administer the HUD housing assistance, housing vouchers, as well as project-based assistance in public housing? Can we help them prioritize this population based on evidence so the people who are most in need and most likely to benefit from housing assistance are prioritized over other families locally? And are there ways to streamline the administration of the housing voucher program or the property inspection program that HUD administers through local housing authorities to reduce some of the occupancy delays and increase participation by local landlords who are sometimes resistant to using federal assistance? So those are some of the questions we are putting on the table at the federal level. We're looking more generally at ways that make it easier for the local people to pool their federal funds and other resources. If they commit to a goal of ending homelessness, say, or an ambitious target to reduce homelessness in their community, can they then be given by the federal government through waivers or other means more flexibility in administering that assistance in a coherent way? Kathy Stack, who we talked to a lot, Napa fellow, has worked on this issue among others. And then Shelley and Beth have been looking at the data questions. How can we take advantage of the data that's being generated by these local information systems that are required to target, for example, prevention efforts to people who are about to fall into homelessness, who a small population that, let's say, people aging out of foster care would be a good example, because they're at very high risk of homelessness at that point in their personal trajectory. So is there a way to use the data to be much more effective in targeting populations like that? Because if you don't prevent the flow of people into homelessness, then it's no matter how many thousands of people you place in a locality in housing, you're always going to have a new flow of people into homelessness that you have to tackle. So we need to explore these issues in a very practical way with other folks who worked on these problems for a long time, including the federal Interagency Council people at HUD, and so on. Calvin Johnson, who's part of our working group, is at HUD now as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research, and so we're using those conversations to try to take these ideas and make them real. Rich, do you want to say anything more about that before we talk about how we do that?
No, let's go to the next steps.
Okay.
So let me kick this off, if that's okay, Nancy, to talk about your question of how we plan to share the findings of this report.
Absolutely.
So I think the first step is really to recognize how Napa is strategically situated to bring attention and to this issue. Napa has fellows at all levels. You've heard different members of this working group. I'd also like to mention Jan Perry, former city councilwoman for the city of LA, who's worked on this in her district and who was a member of this committee. Now, this committee, this working group, with its membership in city, county, state, federal, districts, and regions, really is a strength that Napa brings to looking at this issue. Secondly, the nonpartisan nature of Napa in its DNA. And so we're looking at really problem solving, not partisanship. And thirdly, Napa's ability to really facilitate and convene. And so part of what Steve and I and other members of the working group have been doing has been sharing the report with others, and with the invitation to one of our metrics of success will be if we start hearing from people, hey, we've been remarkably successful in our jurisdiction. How come you didn't talk to us? The more of those we get, the better off we are, because then we can start looking at those and really start sharing this with the idea of how do we move from, for me personally working on this, I started this with a sense of, if not despair, certainly pessimism. I mean, this has been a growing problem in the areas I see and know, LA County, city and county of San Francisco. I've moved to a position of some cautious optimism based on the work that so many people have done in different areas, and really seeing this as an engagement moving forward on getting at the central question that agile government and that Napa seeks to get at, which is, how do you build trust in the capacity of government? And really, in this case, the capacity of the intergovernmental system. And so I see the next steps as broadening this discussion. Steve talked about one of the findings in those who are addressing people experiencing homelessness is networks. And I think of the quote from the late Bob Agranoff, who used to say in his book, he said, to manage in the public sector is to manage networks. To address homelessness is to engage networks. And so each of us here are individual networks. And, I see Carl Stenberg here, who's a longstanding leading researcher in the intergovernmental systems. Steve mentioned Don Kettle. To build on the academic networks, to build on the different levels of government networks, to build on the associations, and really use this connection to reach a tipping point where we're bringing more research and more understanding, and then more recommendations that build on the successes people have had and address the challenges that they're experiencing. So I think Steve will have some more less conceptual and more concrete suggestions, but that's a starting point for me.
No, I like the idea of thinking of this as a problem of building networks. I would call them networks that can learn from experience.
Yep.
I think that's potentially a role for the Interagency Council to play, and I think they do it to some extent, but doing that much more effectively and systematically so that we can take the lessons from the more successful places to scale across the country and take this on in a bigger way. I think that's the challenge. And a lot of people, this has been a preoccupation of the working group from the first discussions we had, is how are we going to take whatever we're learning here to the larger world of practice effectively and do it in partnership with other people. And Barbara Dyer and other people who worked with networks at the state level or nationally, and Shelley, who's done a lot of thinking about how do you create learning networks rather than just people who focus on a particular task and are accountable for using a particular program to achieve a narrow objective. How do you get a learning process to be self-sustaining over time, and then you apply it to increase the effective use of resources over time? That's to me, that's the problem. We need to now, especially now that we're done with this first report, how do we take it to this larger group? When we are reaching out, Shelley's reaching out to her friends in the White House, for example, who work on these issues, reaching out to the Interagency Council folks, to the people at Community Solutions who are prepared to partner with us. And through each of our personal networks, we're doing some similar things to try to keep this going as a learning process, instead of discussions around practical questions of performance. And, you know, invite other people to offer their ideas on how we do that.
This has been a terrific overview of the paper. Now I'd like to turn to the rest of the room. Time for discussion, responses, reactions. Does this resonate with you? Do you have questions about what they did? My sense is that we've got just enough people that probably raising your hand is a good idea, but feel free to just come off mute and jump right in. So what are your thoughts on the report or questions? Nobody wants to go first.
Well, then we'll call people. I shot a note to Carl, and I know Carl's been a longstanding observer of the intergovernmental system. And so either Carl or Catherine, who's Willoughby, who's co-editor in chief of public administration. Do you have any insights that you think we should be bringing up in terms of recent research or practitioners that have been looking at this that are getting published and that we haven't really mentioned or acknowledged yet?
I yield my time to Catherine.
Well, as I've said, I want this to get into PAR in the practically speaking section, which links practitioners with scholars, and we can use this report and make a stronger connection with the theory of networks, certainly, and issues of governance within an intergovernmental system to make a very good paper for PAR. It would be great to get this out in the January 2025 issue.
And that effort has already started, Catherine. We're working away on it already.
So I think that'll give some play to it, because I think what was said earlier, that this puts homelessness into the public administration field and in an important way. I also wanted to emphasize that I think one of the strengths of this work is the consideration of the vertical and horizontal relationships, and that it really must include the homeless themselves. which I think wasn't emphasized in the earlier discussion. And I think that really moves this in a direction and gives it the urgency that it needs, because those folks need to be included. The other aspect of this is it's a highly fluid, the reason we don't give recommendations, in my view, is it's a highly fluid issue that changes frequently at the local level. And so it's incumbent upon those localities, whatever they may be made up of, a city, a county, regional, whatever, to continually look and define and redefine the problem that they're dealing with so that they can then think about a way forward. I mean, I sometimes think about, I don't know if anybody saw the movie Flight, where Denzel Washington is weaving the airplane up into the little point, and says, we're going to get to that point and then we'll be free. And I think that's an aspect that every locality needs to look and see, where is that, area where we can go through sort of that window of opportunity. So I think that there is a lot here that can be taken forward, and that the report right now provides a great sense of urgency.
Rich, just 2 points following up on Catherine. 3, actually. First, congratulations to you and Stephen, the team, for producing, I think, a really thought-provoking piece of work here. And again, I like the way you labeled it as kind of foundational. And now we need to put the bricks on top. I was kind of surprised at your comment earlier, Rich, about the paucity of research on homelessness and the thinking that it's really not a public administration problem. That was kind of a aha moment for me. And I think it underscores Catherine's point about using PAR and some of the other academic journals that are reaching out to practitioners as a way to kind of broaden the audience and capture the experiences that are out there, hopefully the best practices or success stories. I would add state and local government review to that list of kind of more practitioner-oriented pieces, and outreach, I think, to some of the Big 7, especially ICMA, I think would be well done. My second or third point, I guess in response to, is this a local issue, or and in what sense? And I think, Rich, you made the point that homelessness is more county specific, perhaps in town and municipal, except in very large areas. And I'm kind of thinking this through from a regional standpoint. I noticed Bill Dodge is on the Zoom, but is there something here that we can kind of frame as an opportunity as well as a need for kind of regional organizations, or regional organizations as conveners or whatever? My experience here in North Carolina is and I'm nowhere near on top of it, but from what I hear anecdotally, the counties and municipalities, are kind of working in their own silos too often. And, as Bev Ziegler once said, cooperation is an unnatural act committed by non-consenting partners. And we're seeing, I think, a fair amount of that in North Carolina and some other states that I'm aware of. And I'm looking at this from a standpoint of Napa putting forward perhaps a kind of a regional strategy, thinking that through in terms of, does that make sense in terms of the political and practical realities of governance at the local level?
Yeah, I think Bill Dodge would be delighted to weigh in on that question. And I just say that the region that you want to define to address this varies, again, quite a bit from place to place, depending on obviously it's very different in LA metropolitan area than it is in North Central Massachusetts. So how you define the appropriate region? Most homelessness arises locally. That is, it's not the result of mass migrations of people. And so there are obviously exceptions to that. So it really raises the question of what is the appropriate region, and then what do you create as a governance structure for that region? And again, I think the answer varies. In some places, it makes sense to have a network of equals, and other places it might require creating, maybe in Southern California, requiring a new authority. Mark has worked on similar problems in California.
Yeah,
And
and let me just
one
jump
of
in.
his models is
Steve,
featured
let
in-
me just jump into
Yeah.
Carl's question, and I have to apologize. I'm booked with I double booked myself at 11 o'clock Pacific time. Carl, your unit of analysis of how regional cooperation emerges, what we found in each of the three cases was regionalism looked a little bit different. In central Massachusetts, it was regionalism amongst equals. In Santa Clara County, it was regionalism amongst equals between the continuum of care, nonprofit providers, and county government. In the city of Houston, it was their work that covered a large area and just kind of touched on the counties that surround them. And I think, as Steve said, well, to take a quote from Harvard Divinity School, to know one regional solution is to know none of the others.
No one.
And so perhaps that gives us a starting point. I want to apologize for needing to leave early. I look forward to watching the recording of this and then following up with my colleagues. And again, enormously grateful to Mark and Shelley and the Intergovernmental Systems panel for convening us, and to just really can't say enough great things about my co-chair, Steve Redburn, and bring his experience to help us continue to move forward on this. And Nancy, thank you, and the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships, and Catherine will be working with you to get this out to a larger audience. So thank you all.
Thanks so much, Rich. Let's go
me
to
turn the-
Mark.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead and return the compliment.
Garrison had his number. David Garrison.
Yeah,
hand
Dave
up.
Garrison. I want to hear from the tranquility of Cape Cod. Or how does it look from there?
Yes, well, it pleases me no end to see your brave visits there, Steve, after all these years. Talk about taking on an otherwise intractable project. This is the one. I wanted to offer a contextual point. I chair the Affordable Housing Committee in the town of Falmouth here in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Town of 31,000 people, which becomes a town of about 100,000 during the summer as people come down to stay in their seasonal rentals and home ownership situations. First of all, Steve, here in a county, in Massachusetts, counties are not major players, right? So this is a world of municipalities of various sizes, and you must have seen that in your work with with the Western Mass group. But in a small place like this, even the town really is not the vehicle, it's NGOs. The town really doesn't play a significant role in the process. It's a local NGO in this case. Fortunately, the person who chairs that NGO is on our housing committee, and ironically, tomorrow in our monthly meeting is going to be making a report about the status of homelessness in our town. So I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about that. But that's the first point is, in thinking about this thing as a federal systems question, which I know you are doing, there are situations in which even the locality is not the player. It's the next level down, if that's the way to think about it. The second thing is, and this is probably not true about all places, surely not, but it's certainly true about a lot of places, and that is that the housing conversation here, of which homelessness is certainly a part, is become bigger. And the reason here it's become bigger is because the cost of housing is now so high and in such demand that the local conversation about where resources are going to be invested now is looking at categories that you and I would not have thought possible or even appropriate 20 years ago. We're having conversations in this town and others on the Cape about the extent to which we put public money into providing new homes through homeownership programs for people who are at 120% of area median income. And even above that, we've had one project that's come through and it's reaching out to 140% of area median income. Area median income here in Barnstable County, which is the Cape, is $124,000 a year for a family of two. So my point here is that the political context within which resource allocations occur at the local level, which is the world in which we operate in a place like Massachusetts, has now got other competitors at the trough. And what I'm worried about is that the homelessness conversation down at that far end, if you think about this as a continuum, are going to have trouble competing for resources that are otherwise going to be thought to be available for folks whose income levels are quite high, $120,000 a year, salaried people, in order to afford buying a house that's subsidized through a local program. Now, so all I'm saying is that I sense here at the local level that this conversation is becoming harder because there are more competitors, because of what's happened with the housing market, and the fact that there's essentially no rental housing at all available to anybody of any income in this town. So it's just as I listen to you, I'm a little concerned about this conversation focusing on homelessness, but I would encourage you to think about it also as a competitor for resource allocations at the local level across a whole range of housing decisions.
That's very interesting. As you know, Dave, I could talk all day about housing issues, and would be happy to do that. But let me start with the first part of your comment. The person who's coming to talk to you, are they with the Continuum of Care organization? And do you have an identified continuum of care organization that's funded by HUD to work on homelessness in Falmouth?
Not in that sense. So far as I know, I'll know more about this tomorrow, but I don't believe we do. This particular organization is focused on the physical shelter aspect of homelessness largely, but coordinating their activities with the Human Services Office in the town. So there are town players here, but they're not the coordinators. They're not driving the conversation. They're participants in it, but it's happening because the NGO is leading it, not because the town is leading it. That's all.
So I mentioned that because the Continuum of Care organization is not one type of organization. It doesn't have the same scope in every place. It doesn't have the same capacity in every place. And that's part of the diversity of local circumstances that I was alluding to. And HUD probably created it as a kind of compromise. You know, they wanted to bring people together. They didn't have a clear definition of what the appropriate regional mix would be, or mix of organizations functionally. And so they created these new entities. And I think other people have looked at this, but we are looking at it too and want to continue to understand better. Is this something to build on to make it more consistent in their capacity and their reach, or is it a dead end organizationally? The housing issue, which has become more acute in many communities, there's a high correlation. Research shows between tight housing markets, especially at the low end of the market, and more people flowing into homelessness, as you would expect. It's not just a housing issue, and it's not primarily a housing issue, I would say. But housing has to be part of the solution. So it's troubling to hear that there are more competitors for what's a limited pool of housing resources, assistance resources. So that's a problem. Again, one that affects many communities, some more than others. Houston was very fortunate to start with a soft housing market. Other places have created pools of assistance. Santa Clara, obviously the other extreme, perhaps like Falmouth, very tight housing market, but also a very wealthy community. So, you know, they don't necessarily have to turn to the federal government to solve this problem. They've got enough wealth in Silicon Valley to solve the problem of homelessness if they chose to use their resources appropriately. So it's a complicated and varied issue.
Should we go to Mark and then Shelley?
First of all, Steve, and I'm sorry Rich isn't here. I want to congratulate you. This effort exceeded at least my expectations, and I won't speak for Shelley, in that it took what we've been trying to come to understand in the Intergovernmental System Panel that intergovernmental is not a process. And Rich made, I think, he made a comment that really caught my attention, and that is that intergovernmental is problem solving in this country. And we don't think of it as that. We think of it more as a process as opposed to problem solving. And your 5 categories of questions are explorations. In many respects, may start redefining how we think of this field and how we approach this task of problem solving. And David, your comment with respect to housing and the difficulty that many of our governmental organizations are facing, I think is clearly on the table. And the public's expectation that government is going to deal with these issues, I think, is clearly on the table. And my question to Steve, to you, and also to the group is, how can this way of thinking help us redefine how government in this country operates and operates differently, so that we can respond to what the public and the constituencies of government are expecting but not getting? How can we start using what you've started here? And Shelley, I think it really refines this framework that we started on for about 5 years ago. It brings really real life to it. How can we use this as a launching pad for thinking about other issues?
Shelley, do you want to take that on, or should I say something first?
Go for it, Steve.
Well, I'm flattered that you see this as a launching pad or a starting point for tackling the bigger question of how do you reorganize the intergovernmental system to take on these kinds of cross boundary crossing problems. I don't have, you won't be surprised to hear this, I don't have the answer to that big question, but it's nice to know that we've made a contribution, at least to get started in that direction.
So shall I jump in here now, Steve?
I think you should, yes.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank a lot of the people on this call, because whether it's Barbara Dyer or Catherine, I don't know if she's still here, or Brad Riley, Nancy, there's been a lot of contributions. And for me, this was great because this really was a community. It was tapping the expertise of NAPA fellows and NAPA relationships, and as well as NAPA staff, because we had a lot of staff help too, which is great. Now, where do we go from here? So David Garrison, we don't know each other very well yet. And so I don't know if you're Dave or David, but I'm going to ask you to please consider working on a next step here, which is not building on the immediate foundational work of this report, which explicitly does not look at housing, but also realizes it needs to start to look at housing. So if you would consider sort of playing a role in helping us think about what we ought to do there, I think that'd be great. I listen to you, and I work a lot with Head Start, where what I'm seeing is the same issue happening to Head Start families, which are the lowest income, where you're getting the childcare subsidies in places like New York drive out the money for the lowest income folks. And so I think those are very important things for us to look at.
Sign me up. Sign me up. I'll be glad to help.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You two neighbors need to get together, because Dave was my first boss when I came in through the Personnel Act to HUD to do research on housing programs. He was my first.
Yeah, I'm Dave. I'm a little further out. I'm in Concord. I'm not in Falmouth, but I'd love to do it. And I know the town, as I know Brad understands this Massachusetts towns and townships. I mean, it's a very different way of managing than California and its counties.
Right, and I don't necessarily recommend this form of government, and I bet you don't either. There are a lot of challenges in the town meeting format. I don't necessarily.
Oh, don't even get me started. Started on town meetings and whether they are a little antiquated. I want to raise a few other sort of opportunities for us in thinking as we go forward. I know I'm on the hook to really think more about data. And the way I'm thinking about it, and again, in all of these, if any of you want to help on this, please, whether it's with helping Dave Garrison or me or Steve Redburn and Rich Callahan, on data, I think one of the big questions is who can use the data? How can data be helpful to whom? And that varies by the front line to the feds, right? And that once you think about that, then you have to think about what questions do they want to answer? And then how do you collect, analyze, and share analyses so that it's useful for the people who are asking the questions. So that's, if anybody wants to work on that, that would be great. Steve Redburn, when you started talking, you said things worked pretty well, that some of the federal things they did worked well in terms of funding, in terms of continuum of care. But then you listed 3 things that didn't work so well, right? Upward accountability, burdensome applications, and reporting requirements. And I think that's probably true across a lot of places. And so one of the questions I would raise, is that an area where maybe we want to focus on 1, 2, or 3 of those things to sort of say, is there a better way to do this, especially in the age of AI? You know, I'm actually working with Nick Hart, another fellow, for helping Head Start beneficiaries. Can we use AI to make it easier for them to apply for everything for which they're eligible? So as we think about where to from here, I would urge us to think about that. And then the other thing that Rich isn't on here, but I think Rich keeps pointing out, and I know Barbara, you've thought about this a lot. It's like, and Brad, you helped us connect with the Central Massachusetts folks. Kettle helped us connect with the Houston folks. I can't remember who helped us collect with Community Solutions, but we connected early. And now, as we are done with our first report, they're interested and they want to keep working with us. And I think that's just very instructive for us in Napa and thinking about how do we do this, as a way of doing business. It's not easy, but it is what the Napa fellows can do to help the work with the Napa staff, and what the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships and Nancy and her team are trying so hard to do. So I just wanted to tee those up as specific areas I think all of us can think about. How do we do this?
Yeah, the only way we can tackle these ambitious problems, targets, is with partners. And for example, on the issues you mentioned regarding grants administration and the siloing of functions and so on, a natural partner would be the new Administration Interagency Council on Federal Financial Assistance, Dale Bell, who is the co-chair of that currently. It's only a year old. This should be part of their agenda, and we know them, so we should be able to offer partnership between the academy and them in working on some of these issues. At least that would be my hope. That's just an example.
Well, I'm sure there's others on this call that could add and contribute to how do we take this and build on it. But Stephen and Rich and the team, you really brought to life what both the Napa network of fellows can do and what we can do with partnerships and how we can redefine problem solving in the country so that we can reestablish credibility with the public, which I do believe we are suffering from. And some of the observations and suggestions that have come out of this call will go to the next panel meeting of the Intergovernmental Systems Panel, which is to be held, I believe. Shelley, help me on dates, but I think it's.
I think Rin needs to help us. Rin, are you still there?
Well, the business meeting
Yes,
is
absolutely.
September 26th. Oh, sorry, Rin. Apologies.
No, you're good, and you are correct.
And then you have a meeting at the fall meeting.
Correct, so that we can bring the formulation of how the governmental system, the federal system, including the sectors, how we can be instrumental in problem solving. And I do think that there's some new territory that is being carved out as a result of this effort. And Barbara, I see your hand up. You may want to, I don't want to preempt you from getting your comments in before we adjourn.
Thank you, Mark, and thank everyone. It was such a great honor and pleasure to be part of this working group. I really learned an enormous amount. I just want to mention, and it's also to Dave's point, that in the Massachusetts case, it was the Community Foundation of North Central Massachusetts that was the catalyst, and the role of community foundations across the country it varies from place to place, but many community foundations have the qualities that are necessary to be catalytic on this issue. So I want to make sure that we keep in mind, not necessarily philanthropy across the board, but specifically this brand of philanthropy, the Community Foundation, that has deep roots in places and is often an excellent convener. And also to Steve's point earlier about the COC not being so tightly structured as to eliminate a whole wide variety of possible players that could be playing that role. It establishes a formal link, but in very flexible ways between the federal government, local, and county governments, as well as the nonprofit organizations. So I think we have a real asset in thinking through what these COCs could more effectively accomplish in this not just intergovernmental system, but this vast array of players who are poised to make a difference on these issues. And thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Barbara.
Any additional comments, questions? Okay. I think we have covered it. Again, thanks so much, everybody. Steve, I don't know if you have any parting remarks, but I can certainly express gratitude for everybody taking the time.
I just said that to some people the other day that this feels like the finish line, but I hope the finish line is also a starting line for the next wave of effort here to keep this going.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, Nancy.
All right.